What was behaviorism's view of learning? Ivan Pavlov's early 20th century experiments are psychology's most famous research. In classical conditioning, a type of learning in which one learns to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events, behaviorism psychology should be an objective science that studies behavior without reference to mental processes. Most research psychologists today agree with number one, but not with number two. In other words, we must study behavior and mental processes together. Who is Pavlov, and what are the basic components of classical conditioning? Pavlov was a Russian physiologist. He studied the digestive system, and he won the first Russian Nobel Prize in 1904. He demonstrated associative learning via salivary conditioning. In classical conditioning, a neutral stimulus is a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning. An unconditioned response is an unlearned, naturally occurring response, such as salivation, to an unconditioned stimulus, such as food in the mouth. An unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers an unconditioned response. A conditioned response is a learned response to a previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus, and a conditioned stimulus is an originally irrelevant stimulus that after association with an unconditioned stimulus comes to trigger a conditioned response. For 3 decades, Pavlov's research demonstrated associative learning, exploring 5 major conditioning processes called acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. What are the processes of acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination? In the initial stage, when one links a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus so that the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned response, we call this acquisition. In this case, it would be the sounding of the tone, which is a neutral stimulus, is paired with food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, and eventually the tone alone will become a conditioned stimulus that produces the conditioned response. If we were to not present the food right after the tone, we would eventually have extinction, and this is the diminishing of a conditioned response, and it occurs when an unconditioned stimulus, such as the food, does not follow a conditioned stimulus, such as the tone. If we were to reintroduce the food again after a tone, we would have spontaneous recovery. And that is the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditioned. In this slide, we see the learning curve, or the idealized curve of acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. If we start here at the bottom left, we see it's weak, and again, as we continue to pair these two things together in acquisition, you get a peak. And then once you stop, you'll see the curve actually declines, and this is where we have extinction. And then eventually, if you have the neutral stimulus followed by the unconditioned stimulus, you will get spontaneous recovery, and then eventually you will have extinction again. And this is as the stimuli are presented over time. In classical conditioning, we talk about generalization, and that's the tendency for once a response has been conditioned for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit similar responses. So if we played a particular tone and we got a conditioned response, we might play a tone that's very similar to it and get the same response, even though we did not use that other tone in the classical conditioning. Conversely, discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus, which predicts the unconditioned stimulus, and other irrelevant stimuli. So if we played a tone and we were able to actually get the dog to salivate, we might crash a cymbal, and that is also a noise, but it may not have the same response because that sound has not been paired with the anticipation that the dog will get food. So why does Pavlov's work remain so important? There's a great consensus among psychologists that classical conditioning is a basic form of learning. Why should we care that dogs can be conditioned to the sound of a tone? Many other responses to many other stimuli can be classically conditioned in many other organisms. Pavlov demonstrated how a learning process can be studied objectively, and classical conditioning is a basic form of learning that applies to all species. What is also really important about classical conditioning are some of the applications that exist. Pavlov's principles are used to influence human health and well-being. This includes areas of consciousness, motivation, emotion, health, psychological disorders, and therapy. And relating to disorders, there is a strong relationship between classical conditioning and disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Addicts are counseled to avoid stimuli, for example, people and settings that may trigger cravings. And pairing particular tastes with a drug that influences immune responses may eventually lead to immune responses for that taste alone. Pavlov's work also provided a basis for Watson's ideas that human emotions and behaviors, though biologically influenced, are mainly a bundle of conditioned responses. Watson applied classical conditioning principles in his studies of little Albert, a video we will watch later in the class, to demonstrate how specific fears might be conditioned. Watson boasted that he could take any healthy infant and train for any career specialization regardless of any inborn traits, but later he admitted to going beyond his